Hey guys, welcome back to Atlas Archives, where tonight we're uncovering Eritrea, a nation that punches far above its weight class in the geopolitical boxing ring. Nestled along the Red Sea like a precious gemstone between Sudan and Ethiopia, Eritrea is home to some of Africa's most dramatic landscapes and, quite frankly, some of its most dramatic politics too. From coral reefs that would make marine biologists weep with joy, to highlands so pristine they seem almost suspiciously well behaved, this is a country where ancient trade routes once made merchants fantastically wealthy and modern independents came at a price that still echoes today. Drop a comment below about what you know about Eritrea. We're genuinely curious if anyone can pronounce Asmara correctly on the first try. And if you're settling in for another Atlas Archives deep dive, hit that subscribe button because trust us, this story gets unexpectedly fascinating. So brew some tea, find your coziest corner, and prepare for the surprising tale of Eritrea, where ancient kingdoms, colonial confusion, and modern complexity create one of Africa's most intriguing stories. Chapter 1. Welcome to the Land of Nine Lives. Picture this. Eritrea sits like a weathered triangle on the Horn of Africa, roughly the size of Pennsylvania, though considerably less likely to have a cheesesteak shop on every corner. At 121,000 square kilometers, it's positioned perfectly to catch both the morning sun and the afternoon heat. The country shares borders with three neighbors: Ethiopia to the south, with a border that's been about as stable as a chocolate teapot in the Sahara, Sudan stretching along 605 kilometers to the west, and tiny Djibouti for just 109 kilometers to the southeast. But the real star of the show is Eritrea's eastern boundary. Over 1,000 kilometers of pristine Red Sea coastline that would make a resort developer weep with joy. Now, if you've ever wondered what happens when Mother Nature decides to show off, Eritrea is your answer. The country is essentially a geological playground, where three tectonic plates meet for what can only be described as a very slow-motion wrestling match. The African, Arabian, and Somali plates have been pulling apart here for millions of years, creating a landscape so diverse that you could film a sci-fi movie, a desert epic, and a mountain adventure, all within driving distance of each other. Well, assuming your car has very good air conditioning and possibly its own prayer book, the centerpiece of this geographical theatre is Eritrea's Central Highlands, known locally as the Kebessa, which runs north to south through the middle of the country like a rocky spine. These highlands aren't just hills with delusions of grandeur, they're serious mountains that reach up to 3,018 meters at Mount Swira, Eritrea's highest point. At that altitude, you're high enough to quite literally look down on clouds, though the view is probably better than what you'd get from an airplane window. The highlands maintain a temperate climate year-round, which is nature's way of saying, sorry about that furnace I put right next to you. These central highlands are actually the northern extension of the Ethiopian plateau, formed from crystalline rocks including granite, gneiss, and mica schist that sound like they were named by someone with a geology degree and a stutter. The terrain here is characterized by steep escarpments, rolling hills, and deep valleys that create microclimates, where you can genuinely experience different weather systems within a few kilometers of each other. It's like nature's version of cable television, hundreds of channels and something different every time you change the location. But step away from these pleasant highlands, and Eritrea reveals its more dramatic personality. To the east, the land plunges dramatically toward the Red Sea, creating one of the world's most spectacular drives. The journey from the capital Asmara down to the port of Massawa covers just 65 kilometers, but takes nearly 3 hours of hairpin turns and breathtaking drops. It's the kind of road trip where you'll want to check your brakes twice and possibly update your will beforehand. This eastern escarpment is part of the Great Rift Valley system, that magnificent geological crack that's slowly but surely splitting Africa apart. At the bottom of this dramatic descent lies Eritrea's coastal plain, known as the Semhar, where the temperature rises faster than your phone bill and the landscape becomes decidedly more minimalist. This narrow strip of land is part of the Eritrean coastal desert ecoregion. Here, the terrain consists largely of sand, gravel, and the occasional hardy shrub that's clearly made some questionable life choices. The coastal plain is home to temperatures that regularly exceed 46 degrees Celsius in summer, making it hot enough to cook an egg on the pavement, though finding a chicken brave enough to venture out there might prove challenging. The climate along this coast is what meteorologists politely call hot desert, though surface of Venus might be more accurate during peak summer months. From June to September, the average high temperatures range from 40 to 46 degrees Celsius, which is roughly equivalent to being inside a very large, very angry oven. Yet somehow, life persists here, including the hardy residents of Massawa and other coastal towns who've clearly mastered the art of staying cool in conditions that would make a salamander complain. But wait, there's more. South of the main coastal plain lies one of Earth's most extraordinary and inhospitable regions, the Danakil Depression. This remarkable geological feature extends into Ethiopia and represents one of the lowest and hottest places on our planet. Parts of the depression dip to 75 meters below sea level, creating a landscape so alien that NASA scientists have used it to study conditions that might exist on other worlds. The depression is home to Lake Kulal, Eritrea's lowest point, where the elevation reads like a negative bank balance, and the temperatures could make Death Valley file a formal complaint about workplace conditions. The Danakil Depression isn't just hot and low, it's a geological wonderland of salt flats, active volcanoes, and mineral deposits that create landscapes painted in colours you'd normally associate with a particularly adventurous artist palette. The region sits at the junction of three tectonic plates, making it an active geological laboratory where the Earth's crust is literally pulling apart. This creates hot springs with pH levels that would make battery acid seem mild, colourful mineral formations that look like abstract art installations, and salt flats so vast they've been harvested for centuries. The local Afar people have been mining salt here for generations, loading their camels with 30 salt bricks weighing 4 kilograms each and making the 2-day journey to the nearest market. Speaking of the Afar people and their remarkable salt trade, the Danakil region produces some of the world's finest salt, extracted from deposits that formed when ancient seas evaporated over millions of years. The salt flats stretch for approximately 60,000 square kilometers, creating a white, crystalline desert that's visible from space and bright enough to require sunglasses even on cloudy days. The salt extraction process hasn't changed much over the centuries. Workers venture out in the early morning hours when temperatures are merely scorching rather than life-threatening, hack rectangular blocks from the salt crust using traditional tools, and load them onto long camel caravans for transport to highland markets. Moving to the western side of the country, we encounter Eritrea's third major geographical region, the western lowlands. This area presents a stark contrast to both the highlands and the coastal desert, consisting of flat to rolling plains that slope gradually toward the Sudanese border. The western lowlands are part of the broader Sahel region, characterized by semi-arid conditions and savanna vegetation. Here, the landscape features scattered acacia trees, seasonal grasslands, and agricultural areas where farming is possible during the brief rainy seasons. The western region is crossed by several important seasonal rivers, including the Barka and Seba and Gash rivers, which flow only during the rainy seasons, but provide crucial water resources for both agriculture and wildlife. The Setit River, known as the Tekeze in Ethiopia and the Atbara in Sudan, is Eritrea's only perennial waterway, though calling it navigable would be generous at best. These rivers create green corridors through otherwise dry landscape, supporting wildlife and providing irrigation possibilities for determined farmers. But perhaps Eritrea's most spectacular geographical feature lies offshore in the Red Sea, the Dahlak Archipelago. This collection of over 350 islands represents one of the Red Sea's last pristine marine environments, largely because the 30-year war for independence meant that tourist development was somewhat limited. Only 4 of these islands have permanent inhabitants, leaving the rest to serve as pristine havens for marine life, coral reefs, and the occasional confused tourist who really should have checked their travel insurance policy more carefully. The Dahlak Islands are surrounded by some of the healthiest coral reefs in the world, hosting over 325 fish species, many of which are found nowhere else on Earth. The waters around these islands support dugongs, sea turtles, dolphins, and over 1,400 known fish species, with 17% of them being endemic to Eritrean waters. The coral reefs themselves contain around 250 species of coral, with 20% found exclusively in these Red Sea waters. It's essentially an underwater paradise that remained largely untouched during the decades of conflict, creating a natural marine sanctuary that would make Jacques Cousteau weep with joy. The waters surrounding Eritrea's coastline and islands cover approximately 60,000 square kilometers of territorial waters, making Eritrea's marine territory roughly half the size of its landmass. These waters are part of the Red Sea, that narrow body of water that separates Africa from the Arabian Peninsula and serves as one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. The Red Sea gets its name from seasonal blooms of red-coloured algae, though it's usually a stunning blue-green colour that would make a travel brochure photographer extremely happy. Eritrea's position along this strategic waterway has shaped its history for millennia, as the Red Sea serves as a crucial link between the Mediterranean Sea via the Suez Canal and the Indian Ocean through the Strait of Mandeb, known romantically as Bab el-Mandab or Gate of Tears in Arabic. This name either refers to the dangerous currents that made ancient navigation treacherous, or possibly to the tears of relief from sailors who successfully made it through without hitting a reef. Either way, Eritrea's coastline has been a crucial stop for traders, travellers, and the occasional lost maritime expedition for thousands of years. The country's diverse geography creates equally diverse climate zones that range from temperate to tropical to please make it stop. The highlands enjoy what can generously be called a Mediterranean climate, with temperatures averaging around 17 degrees Celsius and rainfall that actually falls at predictable times. The capital, Asmara, sits at 2,325 metres above sea level and maintains pleasant temperatures year-round, though nights in the winter months can be surprisingly cold, occasionally dropping near freezing. The country experiences 2 rainy seasons because apparently one wasn't complicated enough. The short rains arrive in March and April, providing just enough moisture to tease the landscape before disappearing again. The main rainy season runs from late June to early September, bringing most of the annual precipitation and turning the highlands temporarily green. Annual rainfall in the highlands averages around 500 millimetres, while the coastal areas receive significantly less moisture, usually under 200 millimetres annually. This geographical diversity has created distinct ecoregions within Eritrea's relatively compact borders. The Ethiopian highlands, montane grasslands and woodlands cover the central plateau, featuring endemic plant species and wildlife adapted to the cooler mountain conditions. The eastern coastal areas are part of the Eritrean coastal desert, characterized by sparse vegetation, including acacia trees, various succulents, and plants that have clearly mastered the art of water conservation. Eritrea's geological foundation lies within the Arabian-Nubian Shield, a formation rich in mineral deposits that has made the country increasingly attractive to mining companies. The shield contains significant deposits of gold, copper, zinc, potash, and other valuable minerals, many of which remain largely untapped. The Coluli Potash project in the Danakil Depression represents one of the world's most promising potash deposits, with an estimated 1.08 billion tons of ore containing 18% potassium chloride. The deposit is remarkably shallow, with potash resources found just 16 meters below the surface, making extraction relatively economical despite the challenging environmental conditions. The Bisha mine, operated by Chinese company Zijin Mining Group, has been producing gold, copper, and zinc since 2011, demonstrating that it's possible to extract mineral wealth even in challenging conditions. The mine produces approximately 350,000 ounces of gold annually, though workers probably deserve hazard pay for dealing with temperatures that could melt chocolate bars in their pockets. The Red Sea Basin also holds potential oil and natural gas reserves, though exploration has been limited due to various political and economic factors. In this remarkable geographical setting, where ancient tectonic forces continue to reshape the landscape, and where temperatures can vary by 30 degrees depending on your elevation, we find a country that perfectly demonstrates nature's ability to pack incredible diversity into a relatively small space. From coral reefs to salt deserts, from highland forests to coastal plains, Eritrea offers a geographical sampler platter that would take most countries several time zones to achieve. It's a land where camels carry salt loads through landscapes that look like abstract art, where fishermen work waters that contain species found nowhere else on Earth, and where the simple act of travelling from the capital to the coast provides a journey through multiple climate zones and geological eras. As we settle in for our exploration of this remarkable country's history, culture, and people, remember that geography is never just about rocks, weather, and elevation markers on a map. Eritrea's diverse landscapes have shaped its people, influenced its history, and continue to present both opportunities and challenges for its future. From the ancient trade routes that connected the Red Sea to the African interior, to the modern mining projects that tap into geological resources millions of years in the making, this is a country where the physical environment has always played a starring role in the human story. Chapter 2: Ancient Roots and Royal Troubles. As we settle deeper into our journey through Eritrea's remarkable story, we leave behind the geological wonders and venture into the realm of ancient kingdoms, ambitious kings, and trade routes that connected civilizations across continents. Tonight, we explore an era when Eritrea wasn't just a geographical expression but the heart of one of the world's most powerful empires. This is the story of ancient roots that run deeper than most countries' recorded history, and royal troubles that would make a modern soap opera writer weep with envy. Long before anyone had heard of globalization, the Red Sea coast of what we now call Eritrea was already hosting one of history's most successful international trade networks. Picture, if you will, the bustling port of Adulis around the 3rd century of the Common Era. Ships from Rome bobbed alongside vessels from India, their holds packed with silk, spices, ivory, and gold. Merchants haggled in a dozen languages, while camels loaded with frankincense waited patiently in the sweltering heat, probably wondering how they'd ended up in the ancient equivalent of a duty-free shop. This wasn't just any ordinary port town. Adulis was the maritime gateway to one of the ancient world's 4 great empires, a kingdom so wealthy and powerful that it struck fear into the hearts of Persian emperors and earned respectful nods from Roman generals. But before we meet this empire, we need to travel back even further, to the mysterious origins of civilization in this remarkable region. The story begins with a kingdom whose name sounds like someone clearing their throat very dramatically. Damt, pronounced Da'amat, which ruled the northern highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea from roughly the 8th to the 4th century before the Common Era. The kingdom of Damt was like that impressive older sibling who sets impossibly high standards, sophisticated, well-connected, and frustratingly little understood by historians. Archaeological evidence suggests that Damt was influenced by contact with the kingdom of Saba across the Red Sea in modern-day Yemen, though scholars have thankfully abandoned the rather patronizing old theory that civilization in this region was simply imported wholesale by Arabian migrants. The truth, as it often is, proves more interesting than the simplified version. Rather than a sudden invasion of South Arabian settlers, the evidence points to centuries of gradual cultural exchange and intermarriage that created a unique hybrid civilization. Think of it as the ancient world's version of cultural fusion, except instead of fusion cuisine, you got fusion kingdoms with their own writing systems, religious practices, and architectural styles. Archaeological sites from this era paint a picture of a sophisticated society with impressive stone architecture, complex urban planning, and extensive trade networks. The capital at Yeha featured massive temples built without mortar, using precisely cut stones that fit together with the kind of accuracy that would make modern engineers slightly jealous. As the kingdom of Damt gradually declined in the 4th century before the Common Era, perhaps due to climate changes or shifting trade routes, the stage was set for the emergence of something even more spectacular. The kingdom of Aksum emerged in the 1st century of the Common Era like a particularly ambitious startup that decides to take on established corporations and somehow succeeds beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Starting from a relatively modest regional centre, Aksum would grow to become what the 3rd century Persian prophet Mani called one of the 4 great powers of his time, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Imagine trying to explain to someone in the 1st century that this highland kingdom would eventually control territory stretching from the Sudan to Yemen, mint its own internationally recognized currency, and build monuments that still inspire wonder nearly 2,000 years later. The Aksumite Empire at its height was a truly impressive sight, covering parts of what we now call Eritrea, northern Ethiopia, eastern Sudan, western Yemen, and southern Saudi Arabia. It controlled some of the most important trade routes in the ancient world. The empire's capital at Aksum was a cosmopolitan metropolis, with a peak population of around 20,000 people, featuring massive stone palaces, elaborate tombs, and the famous stelae, enormous stone obelisks that served as royal tomb markers and apparently as ancient architectural showing-off mechanisms. The largest of these monuments originally stood over 33 meters tall, making it taller than most modern buildings and definitely taller than anything the neighbors were building. But it was the port city of Adulis, located on the Red Sea coast in what is now Eritrea, that really made the whole operation possible. Adulis wasn't just a port, it was the beating heart of a trade network that connected 3 continents. Ships arrived from Alexandria carrying Roman-manufactured goods, silk, and wine. Vessels from India brought spices, precious stones, and exotic textiles. Local merchants offered ivory from the African interior, gold from highland mines, emeralds, tortoiseshell, and the incredibly valuable aromatic resins, frankincense, and myrrh. The city covered around 100 acres and featured sophisticated harbour facilities, warehouses, and residential districts. The scale of Aksumite commerce was genuinely impressive by any standard. Aksumite coins, minted in gold, silver, and bronze according to Roman weight standards, have been discovered as far away as India, suggesting trade relationships that spanned the entire Indian Ocean. The kingdom exported not just raw materials but also agricultural products from its fertile highland territories, including coffee, which was first cultivated in the Ethiopian highlands and exported through Eritrean ports to the wider world. If you've ever wondered where your morning coffee addiction comes from, you can trace its origins back to these ancient Eritrean trade routes and the ambitious merchants who first figured out that people in other countries might pay good money for roasted coffee beans. The Aksumite military was equally impressive and considerably more intimidating than their commercial success might suggest. The empire maintained powerful armies that could project force across the Red Sea, launch successful expeditions into Arabia, and defend their territory against Persian invasions. Around 320 Common Era, Aksumite forces conquered the declining kingdom of Kush, extending their influence into the Nile Valley. In the 6th century, King Caleb launched a major expedition across the Red Sea to intervene in Yemeni politics, ostensibly to protect persecuted Christians, but probably also to secure valuable Arabian trade routes. These weren't small-scale raids. They were major military operations involving thousands of troops and complex logistical planning. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation in Aksumite history occurred in the early 4th century, when Emperor Ezana made a decision that would reshape not just his empire, but the religious landscape of Africa forever. Ezana converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the first kingdoms in the world to officially adopt Christianity as a state religion. This wasn't just a personal spiritual decision. It was a major geopolitical move that aligned Aksum with the increasingly Christian Roman Empire and differentiated it from its Persian and Arabian competitors. The conversion was reportedly influenced by Frumentius, a Syrian Greek Christian who had been shipwrecked on the Red Sea coast, taken to the Aksumite court, and eventually became the young prince's tutor. The adoption of Christianity transformed Aksumite culture in ways that are still visible today. Churches and monasteries began appearing throughout the empire, including magnificent structures in Adulis that served as both religious centres and symbols of imperial power. The famous Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion in Aksum became one of the most important Christian sites in Africa. According to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, this church houses the original Ark of the Covenant, though visitors are advised not to ask for proof, as the church authorities take a rather firm position on this particular claim. Whether or not you believe the Ark story, the church represents the beginning of a Christian tradition in this region that has persisted for over 1600 years. The Christianization of the empire also had practical effects on trade and diplomacy. Aksumite merchants could now rely on Christian networks throughout the Roman and later Byzantine territories, while diplomatic relationships with Constantinople became closer and more profitable. Christian symbols began appearing on Aksumite coins, making them some of the first currency in the world to feature the cross. The empire also became a refuge for early Christians fleeing persecution elsewhere, including, according to Islamic tradition, some of the earliest followers of the Prophet Muhammad, who sought sanctuary in the Christian kingdom across the Red Sea. The cultural achievements of the Aksumite period were remarkable by any standard. The empire developed its own writing system, Ge'ez, which evolved from earlier South Arabian scripts but was adapted for local Semitic languages. Ge'ez served as the language of administration, trade, and religious texts, and remains the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox and Eritrean Orthodox churches today. This means that over 100 million people in Ethiopia and Eritrea still use a script that was developed in this ancient empire, making it one of the longest continuously used writing systems in Africa. Aksumite architecture was equally impressive and considerably more durable than most ancient construction projects. The builders developed sophisticated techniques for working with the local granite, creating massive structures without mortar by cutting stones so precisely that they fit together perfectly. The famous stelae required advanced engineering to quarry, transport, and erect. The largest examples weigh hundreds of tons and were carved from single pieces of granite. Moving these monuments would have required sophisticated understanding of mechanics, considerable workforce organization, and probably a great deal of creative problem-solving when things went wrong. The empire's agricultural systems supported urban populations, funded military expeditions, and provided the economic foundation for impressive construction projects. Aksumite farmers developed terraced farming techniques that maximized productive land in the highland regions and irrigation systems that captured seasonal rainfall. They cultivated not just coffee but also grains, legumes, and various cash crops that could be exported through Adulis. The social structure was hierarchical but apparently offered considerable opportunities for social mobility, at least by ancient standards, with successful traders able to rise in status and influence. The decline of the Aksumite Empire was as dramatic as its rise, though considerably more mysterious and frustrating for historians. By the 7th century, the empire was clearly in trouble. Climate change appears to have reduced agricultural productivity in the highlands, while shifting trade routes and political changes in the Byzantine Empire disrupted traditional commercial relationships. The rise of Islamic powers in Arabia created new competitors for Red Sea trade, and by the 8th century, Muslim forces had gained control of the strategically important Dahlak archipelago, effectively cutting off Aksumite access to maritime trade routes. The famous sack of Adulis by Arab forces in 641 Common Era marked the beginning of the end for Aksumite power. Though the empire managed to repel the inland invasion that followed, nevertheless, the damage to their crucial port city was devastating, and Adulis never fully recovered its former importance. Archaeological evidence suggests that the city was largely abandoned by the late 7th century, forcing the Aksumite court to retreat into the highland interior and essentially transforming the empire from a maritime trading power into a landlocked highland kingdom. This transition marked the end of Aksum's role as a major player in international politics and the beginning of a period of isolation that would last for several centuries. As we reach the end of our journey through ancient Eritrea's golden age, it's worth reflecting on just how remarkable this period was. For over 6 centuries, the ports and highlands of Eritrea were at the center of one of the world's most successful empires, connecting civilizations across 3 continents and pioneering innovations in trade, architecture, religion, and governance that would influence the region for millennia to come. The Aksumite Empire demonstrated that African kingdoms could compete successfully with the greatest powers of the ancient world, creating wealth, culture, and political influence that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Chapter 3: When Outsiders Moved In. As we continue our exploration of Eritrea's rich tapestry of history, we now venture into what we might diplomatically call the uninvited guests period. Following the decline of the mighty Aksumite Empire, Eritrea's strategic Red Sea coast became something of a revolving door for various powers who all seemed to think they knew better than the locals how things should be run. Tonight, we explore 5 centuries of foreign rule, from Ottoman administrators who treated the coast like a distant vacation rental, to Egyptian modernizers with ambitious plans and unfortunate military skills, to Italian colonizers who built some of the world's most beautiful cities while implementing some of its most problematic policies. Our story picks up in the early 1600s, when the mighty Ottoman Empire was feeling particularly ambitious about Red Sea real estate. The Ottomans had been expanding their influence throughout the Mediterranean, and were now casting envious glances at the strategic ports along the African coast. In 1557, Ottoman forces under Özdemir Pasha captured Massawa, apparently deciding that what the ancient port really needed was Turkish administration and considerably higher taxes. The Ottomans established what they grandly called the Habesh Eyalet, a province that theoretically included much of the Red Sea coast, but in practice extended about as far inland as their garrison commanders felt comfortable walking on any given day. The Ottoman approach to colonial administration was rather pragmatic. which is a polite way of saying they were primarily interested in collecting customs duties and avoiding unnecessary expenses. They maintained a garrison in Massawa and appointed local governors called naibs to handle day-to-day administration, essentially creating a system where Ottoman officials could stay safely on their island fortress, while local administrators dealt with the challenges of actually governing. It was like having a very expensive security company that only protected the front door while leaving the rest of the house to manage itself. This arrangement worked reasonably well for everyone involved, provided you didn't mind paying Ottoman taxes for services you weren't entirely certain you were receiving. The Ottomans did make some lasting contributions to Massawa's development, constructing much of the old town's distinctive architecture using coral, stone and imported wood. The narrow streets, distinctive buildings, and Islamic architectural elements that still characterize historic Massawa largely date from this period. They also established trade networks that connected the port more closely to the broader Ottoman commercial system, facilitating commerce with Egypt, Arabia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. However, their attempts to expand inland were considerably less successful, running into determined resistance from highland communities who had their own ideas about taxation and governance. The most notable Ottoman attempt at highland expansion occurred in 1578, when they decided to test their military luck against the Ethiopian Empire. This turned out to be one of those historical moments when confidence significantly exceeded capability. Ethiopian forces, who had been dealing with various invaders for centuries and had developed considerable expertise in highland warfare, systematically defeated Ottoman expeditions and forced them back to the coast. By 1589, the Ottomans had essentially given up on territorial expansion and settled for controlling what they could actually defend, which turned out to be mainly Massawa and its immediate surroundings. For over 2 centuries, Ottoman rule remained largely confined to the coastal areas, where their influence was real but relatively limited. They controlled trade, collected taxes, and maintained diplomatic relationships, but their impact on highland communities was minimal. This was a remarkably stable arrangement that probably would have continued indefinitely if global politics hadn't started shifting in the 19th century. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 suddenly made Red Sea ports far more strategically valuable than anyone had previously imagined. What had been a profitable but relatively minor trade route now became one of the world's most important shipping lanes, connecting Europe to Asia via the new Egyptian canal. This development caught the attention of the Khedivate of Egypt, which was technically still part of the Ottoman Empire but had been acting increasingly independently under its ambitious ruler, Khedive Ismail Pasha. In 1865, the Egyptians convinced the Ottoman government to transfer control of Massawa and several other Red Sea ports to Egyptian administration, beginning a new and considerably more eventful chapter in Eritrean history. Khedive Ismail was a ruler with big dreams and an even bigger appetite for modernization projects. He had already transformed much of Egypt with new infrastructure, expanded agricultural systems, and ambitious urban development programs, and he saw the Red Sea coast as the next logical area for Egyptian expansion. Unlike the Ottomans, who had been content to collect taxes and avoid trouble, the Egyptians arrived with plans for territorial expansion, economic development, and the kind of ambitious engineering projects that looked impressive on maps, but often proved challenging in practice. Egyptian rule brought immediate changes to Massawa and its surroundings. The new administrators invested in port improvements, constructed new buildings, and established more systematic trade relationships with the interior. They also brought with them a more ambitious approach to territorial control, viewing the highland regions not as troublesome neighbours to be avoided, but as potential additions to Egyptian territory. However, Egyptian territorial ambitions soon led to serious problems with the Ethiopian Empire. Khedive Ismail, apparently believed that Egyptian military superiority would allow him to extend his territory well into the Ethiopian highlands, controlling the headwaters of the Blue Nile and establishing Egyptian hegemony over the entire region. This proved to be one of those historical miscalculations that seemed reasonable in theory, but failed rather spectacularly when tested against reality. Ethiopian Emperor Johannes IV and his military commanders turned out to be considerably more formidable opponents than Egyptian planners had anticipated. The Egyptian-Ethiopian War of 1874 to 1876 became a masterclass in how not to conduct highland military campaigns. Egyptian forces, despite being equipped with modern weapons and European military advisors, suffered devastating defeats at the battles of Gundet and Gura. These weren't close tactical defeats where a few strategic adjustments might have changed the outcome. They were comprehensive disasters where entire Egyptian armies were annihilated by Ethiopian forces using classic highland warfare tactics. The Battle of Gura in particular saw approximately 13,000 Egyptian troops routed by Emperor Johannes's forces, with thousands killed and the survivors retreating in disorder back to the coast. The scale of these defeats was genuinely shocking to contemporary observers and effectively ended Egyptian dreams of territorial expansion into the highlands. Emperor Johannes reportedly demanded that Egypt pay £2 million in reparations and surrender the port of Massawa, though he eventually settled for less ambitious terms. Egyptian rule continued along the coast for another decade after their military disasters, but their position was clearly weakened. The combination of military defeats, financial problems, and increasing British influence in Egyptian affairs made their Red Sea territories something of a liability rather than an asset. Enter the Italians, who arrived on the scene with the kind of systematic planning and long-term vision that had been largely absent from previous foreign interventions. The Italian Rubattino Navigation Company had purchased land around the small port of Assab in 1869, ostensibly for commercial purposes, but actually as part of a broader Italian strategy for establishing a foothold in the Red Sea region. When Egyptian rule began to weaken in the 1880s, Italy was perfectly positioned to expand its influence, and in February 1885, Italian troops occupied Massawa without resistance from the exhausted Egyptian garrison. The Italian occupation of Massawa marked the beginning of what would become the most transformative period in Eritrean history since the fall of Aksum. Unlike their predecessors, the Italians arrived with detailed plans for territorial consolidation, systematic economic development, and the creation of a proper colony rather than just a trading post with administrative pretensions. They also brought with them European ideas about urban planning, industrial development, and infrastructure construction that would fundamentally reshape Eritrean society over the following decades. Italian expansion from their coastal base proceeded systematically throughout the 1880s and 90s. Unlike the Egyptians, who had attempted to conquer the highlands through direct military assault, the Italians used a combination of diplomacy, economic incentives, and carefully planned military operations to extend their control inland. They established agreements with local leaders, constructed roads and communication systems, and gradually extended their administrative control up the escarpment toward the highland plateau. By 1890, they had established effective control over most of what would become the Italian colony of Eritrea. The formal establishment of the colony of Eritrea in January 1890 marked the beginning of one of Africa's most intensive periods of European colonial development. The Italians approached colonization with systematic thoroughness, surveying territory, establishing administrative systems, planning urban developments, and beginning construction projects that would transform Eritrean society over the following 5 decades. Unlike previous foreign rulers who had been primarily interested in trade and taxation, the Italians aimed to create a genuinely modern colony that would serve as a showcase for Italian colonial capabilities. The transformation of Asmara from a collection of highland villages into one of Africa's most impressive modernist cities represents perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Italian colonial rule. When the Italians first established their highland administrative centre in the 1890s, Asmara consisted of 4 small villages, collectively known as Arbate Asmara. Within 50 years, it had become a planned city of over 60,000 residents, featuring some of the world's finest examples of early 20th century modernist architecture, comprehensive urban infrastructure, and systematic planning that would influence urban development throughout Africa. The construction of the Eritrean Railway, connecting Massawa to Asmara and eventually extending toward the Sudanese border, represented another major Italian achievement that required considerable engineering expertise and substantial financial investment. The railway had to climb from sea level to over 2,300 meters elevation over a distance of just 65 kilometers, requiring the construction of numerous tunnels, bridges, and switchbacks. The project was completed in 1911 and remained operational for decades, facilitating both colonial administration and economic development throughout the region. Italian colonial policy underwent significant changes following Benito Mussolini's rise to power in 1922, and especially after 1935, when Italian East Africa was established and Eritrea became the industrial centre of a larger colonial empire. The fascist period brought both remarkable architectural achievements and increasingly oppressive racial policies that segregated Eritrean and Italian communities and limited opportunities for local advancement. The period from 1935 to 1941 saw the construction of most of Asmara's famous modernist buildings, including cinemas, hotels, government buildings, and residential complexes that represented the height of colonial urban planning. However, this same period also saw the implementation of racial laws that restricted Eritrean access to education, employment, and social services, creating a segregated society that contradicted the modernist ideals expressed in the colony's architectural achievements. The contradiction between architectural beauty and social oppression became one of the defining characteristics of late colonial Eritrea. The Italian colonial period ended abruptly in 1941 when British forces defeated Italian armies throughout East Africa and occupied Eritrea as part of their World War II campaign. As we reach the end of this remarkable period of foreign rule, it's worth reflecting on the complex legacy that 5 centuries of Ottoman, Egyptian, and Italian administration left for modern Eritrea. Each colonial power contributed different elements to Eritrean society. Ottoman architectural styles and trade connections, Egyptian administrative systems and urban development, and Italian infrastructure, urban planning, and industrial development, but each also imposed external control over local communities, extracted resources for foreign benefit, and created political and social systems that served colonial rather than local interests. The colonial period fundamentally transformed Eritrean society, creating modern cities, transportation networks, and administrative systems, while also establishing the territorial boundaries and institutional frameworks that would shape the independent nation. The experience of foreign rule also contributed to the development of Eritrean national consciousness, as people from different regions and communities found themselves sharing common experiences under colonial administration and eventually developing shared aspirations for self-determination. As we'll discover in our next chapter, these colonial legacies would play crucial roles in both the struggle for independence and the challenges of building a modern nation. Chapter 4: The Longest Goodbye. As we continue our journey through Eritrea's remarkable history, we now arrive at what might be called the most dramatic chapter yet, a 52-year period that began with liberation from fascist rule and ended with hard-won independence, but included along the way a failed federation, a 30-year war, and some of the most complex geopolitical maneuvering in modern African history. Tonight we explore the longest goodbye, the extended and often painful process by which Eritrea finally achieved the independence that many of its people had been seeking for decades. Our story begins in 1941 with the roar of British artillery at the Battle of Keren, where Allied forces finally broke the back of Italian resistance in East Africa. After months of brutal fighting in the highlands, British and Commonwealth forces defeated the Italian army in April 1941, bringing to an abrupt end 5 decades of Italian colonial rule. For most Eritreans, this was initially cause for celebration. The fascist racial laws were immediately abolished, political prisoners were released, and there was hope that this might finally be the moment when they would gain control over their own destiny. Unfortunately, as often happens with international politics, reality turned out to be considerably more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The British military administration that took control of Eritrea was intended to be a temporary arrangement while the Allied powers figured out what to do with Italy's former colonies. In practice, this temporary administration lasted over a decade and proved to be one of the most consequential periods in Eritrean history. The British approached their task with systematic efficiency but also with a complete lack of understanding about Eritrean political aspirations, and a disturbing tendency to view the territory primarily as a collection of assets to be disposed of rather than a homeland to millions of people. One of the British administration's first acts was to systematically dismantle much of the industrial infrastructure that the Italians had built, shipping machinery, equipment, and entire factories to Kenya and other British territories as war reparations. The famous Asmara-Massawa cableway was dismantled and sent to India. Factories were stripped of their equipment. The railway system was partially dismantled, and much of the modern infrastructure that had made Eritrea one of Africa's most industrialized territories was either destroyed or relocated. It was like having enthusiastic house-sitters who decided to sell all your furniture while you were away, except the house-sitters had tanks and you didn't get to vote on the arrangement. However, the British administration also introduced some genuinely positive changes that would have lasting impacts on Eritrean society. They allowed the formation of political parties, trade unions, and other civil society organizations for the first time in decades. They expanded educational opportunities and permitted a degree of press freedom and political expression that hadn't existed under fascist rule. This political opening unleashed a remarkable flourishing of Eritrean political consciousness, as people from different regions, religions, and ethnic groups began organizing around shared interests and developing sophisticated political programs for their country's future. By the late 1940s, Eritrean society had organized itself into several competing political movements that represented different visions for the territory's future. The Unionist Party, led by Tedla Bairu and supported primarily by Highland Christians, favoured union with Ethiopia. The Muslim League, led by Ibrahim Sultan, advocated for independence or UN trusteeship, and drew its support mainly from lowland Muslim communities. In between these positions were various groups like the Liberal Progressive Party that favoured some form of autonomous federation with Ethiopia. These weren't just political parties, they represented fundamentally different conceptions of Eritrean identity and its place in the region. The international community, meanwhile, was trying to figure out what to do with this strategically important but politically complicated territory in the context of emerging Cold War tensions. The United States was primarily interested in maintaining access to military facilities in Asmara. Ethiopia wanted to annex Eritrea outright, partly for access to Red Sea ports and partly because Emperor Haile Selassie believed that Eritrea had always been an integral part of Ethiopia. The Soviet Union initially supported returning Eritrea to Italy under trusteeship, mainly to spite the Western Allies. After years of diplomatic wrangling, the United Nations finally reached what seemed like a compromise in December 1950 with Resolution 390A. This resolution created a federation between Ethiopia and Eritrea that was supposed to satisfy both Ethiopian claims to sovereignty and Eritrean aspirations for self-government. Eritrea would maintain its own government, parliament, flag, and official languages, while Ethiopia would control defense, foreign affairs, and currency. It was the kind of elegant diplomatic solution that looked reasonable on paper, but proved nearly impossible to implement in practice. The federation officially began on September 15, 1952, following elections for an Eritrean assembly and the adoption of a democratic constitution. Tedla Bairu became the first chief executive of Eritrea, while Emperor Haile Selassie ratified both the Federal Act and the Eritrean constitution. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that this arrangement might actually work. Eritrea maintained its own democratic institutions, its multilingual character, and a degree of autonomy that allowed for significant local self-government. Unfortunately, the federation was doomed from the start by fundamentally incompatible expectations. Ethiopian leaders viewed it as a temporary arrangement that would eventually lead to full integration of Eritrea into the Ethiopian Empire. Eritrean leaders who had supported the federation expected that it would lead to greater autonomy over time. Emperor Haile Selassie and his advisors began systematically undermining Eritrean autonomy almost immediately. Political parties were banned in 1955, trade unions were dissolved in 1958, and the Eritrean flag was replaced with the Ethiopian flag. The final blow came on November 14, 1962, when the Ethiopian parliament voted to formally dissolve the federation and annex Eritrea as a simple province of Ethiopia. The Eritrean assembly, under enormous pressure and with many independence-minded members already in exile, voted unanimously to accept this dissolution. This annexation marked the end of any hope for a peaceful resolution to Eritrean aspirations for self-government and set the stage for one of Africa's longest and most devastating wars of independence. On September 1st, 1961, just over a year before the formal annexation, a small group of Eritrean rebels led by Hamid Idris Awate had already fired the first shots of what would become a 30-year armed struggle. Awate and his 6 companions, armed with old rifles and unlimited determination, attacked Ethiopian police stations in the Barka region of western Eritrea, beginning what would eventually grow into one of the most successful independence movements in modern African history. The early years of the independence struggle were dominated by the Eritrean Liberation Front, founded in 1960 by Eritrean intellectuals in Cairo. The LF initially operated as a relatively small guerrilla movement in the western lowlands, drawing support primarily from Muslim communities and receiving assistance from Arab countries including Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Throughout the 1960s, the ELF grew steadily in size and capability, but also faced serious internal challenges related to its organizational structure and political vision that eventually led to violent conflicts within the independence movement. The most serious split occurred in 1970 when a group of young fighters, frustrated with the ELF's leadership, broke away to form the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. The EPLF founders, including a young engineering student named Isaias Afwerki, had received military training in China and Syria and brought advanced guerrilla warfare techniques and a more sophisticated political ideology. They established their base in the Sahel Mountains of northern Eritrea and began developing what would become one of the most effective guerrilla organizations in modern history. The character of the independence struggle changed dramatically in 1974 when a military coup in Ethiopia overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie and brought to power a Marxist military government known as the Derg, led by Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam. the Derg proved to be even more determined than the imperial government to maintain Ethiopian control over Eritrea, and they had access to massive Soviet military assistance that made them far more dangerous opponents. Ethiopian forces were equipped with modern Soviet tanks, aircraft, and artillery, while Soviet and Cuban advisors helped plan military operations. Despite these overwhelming odds, the Eritrean independence movements not only survived but actually expanded their control over Eritrean territory during the late 1970s. The EPLF in particular proved remarkably adaptable and innovative, developing their own weapons manufacturing capabilities, establishing effective administration in liberated areas, and building a sophisticated political organization that transcended ethnic and religious divisions. By 1977, the combined ELF and EPLF forces controlled most of Eritrea and seemed poised to drive Ethiopian forces out entirely. However, the Soviet Union responded to Ethiopian military setbacks by launching one of the largest airlifts of military equipment in Cold War history, providing the Derg with hundreds of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, along with thousands of Cuban advisors. Between 1978 and 1986, Ethiopian forces launched 8 major offensives against the independence movements, using tactics designed to crush guerrilla resistance through overwhelming force. The EPLF was forced to retreat to its mountain strongholds in the Sahel region, where they spent nearly a decade under constant attack. The EPLF's survival during this period required extraordinary resilience and self-reliance. They learned to manufacture their own weapons, grow their own food, and maintain their organization under conditions that would have destroyed most liberation movements. They built underground hospitals, schools, and workshops in mountain caves, developed their own pharmaceutical industry, and created parallel institutions that could function even under bombardment. The conflict was characterized by brutal tactics, particularly by Ethiopian forces who deliberately targeted civilian populations, but these tactics ultimately strengthened rather than weakened support for independence. The turning point came in March 1988 with the Battle of Alphabet, where EPLF forces achieved their most decisive victory against the Ethiopian army. In a carefully planned operation, the EPLF destroyed an entire Ethiopian division and captured massive quantities of weapons and equipment. The victory at Alphabet marked the beginning of the end for Ethiopian control over Eritrea, as it demonstrated that even with massive Soviet support, the Ethiopian army could be defeated by well-organized guerrilla forces. The final phase of the independence struggle coincided with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet support for the Ethiopian government. As glasnost and perestroika transformed Soviet foreign policy, Moscow began reducing its military assistance to client states like Ethiopia. Without Soviet weapons and advisors, Ethiopian forces found themselves increasingly unable to maintain control over Eritrean territory, particularly as the EPLF allied with other Ethiopian opposition groups fighting the Derg government. The end came with remarkable speed once the Ethiopian government began to collapse. In February 1990, the EPLF launched Operation Fenkill and captured the strategic port of Massawa after a brilliant amphibious assault. By May 1991, Ethiopian forces throughout Eritrea were disintegrating through mass surrenders and desertions, and EPLF fighters entered Asmara on May 24th without a fight, as the last Ethiopian troops fled the city. The independence of Eritrea was formally confirmed 2 years later through a UN-supervised referendum in which 99.8% of voters chose independence. On May 24, 1993, exactly 2 years after the liberation of Asmara, Eritrea officially became the world's newest independent nation and was admitted to the United Nations. After 52 years of foreign rule, failed federation, and brutal war, Eritreans had finally achieved the independence that many had been seeking since the end of Italian colonial rule. As we conclude this remarkable chapter of The Longest Goodbye, it's worth reflecting on just how extraordinary this achievement was. A small country with limited resources had managed to defeat two different superpowers and outlast one of the longest independence struggles in modern history. The 30-year war cost hundreds of thousands of lives and left the country devastated, but it also forged a strong sense of national identity and demonstrated that determined people fighting for their freedom could overcome seemingly impossible odds. As we'll discover in our final chapter, the challenges of building an independent nation would prove nearly as difficult as winning independence itself. Chapter 5. Freedom at Last, or is it? In the spring of 1993, Eritrea seemed poised to become one of Africa's great success stories. The independence referendum had produced a resounding 99.8% vote for independence, demonstrating a level of national unity that was rare anywhere in the world. The EPLF leadership, now transformed into the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, enjoyed enormous legitimacy from their role in the liberation struggle and appeared committed to building a democratic, prosperous nation. International observers were genuinely optimistic that Eritrea might break the cycle of post-colonial failure that had plagued so many African states, becoming instead a model of effective governance and sustainable development. The early signs were indeed encouraging. President Isaias Afwerki, the former EPLF commander who had led the liberation struggle, appeared to be a different kind of African leader. IS, pragmatic, educated, and committed to avoiding the cult of personality that had corrupted so many of his contemporaries. In his first major international appearance at the 1993 African Unity Summit in Cairo, he actually criticized other African leaders for staying in power too long, rejecting any suggestion of creating his own personality cult. The new government began implementing ambitious reconstruction programs, rebuilding infrastructure destroyed during the war, and establishing democratic institutions, including a planned multi-party constitution. Eritrea's approach to post-independence reconstruction was refreshingly self-reliant, emphasizing internal resources and avoiding the dependency relationships that had undermined so many other African countries. The government implemented a national service program that combined military training with development work, mobilizing young Eritreans to rebuild their country while maintaining defensive capabilities. Infrastructure projects moved forward rapidly, connecting isolated regions with new roads and communication networks. The economy began to recover from decades of war, and there was genuine optimism that this small country might actually make independence work where so many others had failed. The international community initially embraced the new Eritrean state with unusual enthusiasm. Donor countries provided significant development assistance, the United Nations welcomed Eritrea as its newest member, and regional organizations praised the peaceful transition to independence. Eritrea was seen as representing a new generation of African leadership that might avoid the mistakes of earlier post-independence governments. President Isaias and his colleagues were frequently compared to other reform-minded African leaders who seemed committed to democratic governance and economic development. However, even during this honeymoon period, there were troubling signs for those who knew how to read them. The PFDJ remained the only legal political party, elections were repeatedly postponed, and the promised multi-party constitution, while drafted and widely debated, was never actually ratified or implemented. Independent media existed but operated within fairly narrow boundaries, and civil society organizations remained largely subordinate to party-controlled mass organizations. Critics at the time argued that Eritrea looked more like a one-party state with democratic rhetoric than a genuinely democratic system, but these concerns were often dismissed given the country's remarkable stability and economic progress. The first major crisis came not from domestic politics, but from an unexpected source, a border dispute with Ethiopia that escalated into a devastating war. In May 1998, a minor skirmish over the tiny border town of Badme spiraled completely out of control, transforming into what would become known as the Badme War, or the Eritrean-Ethiopian War. What began as a dispute over a dusty town that most people in either capital had never heard of, eventually involved over 500,000 troops and became the largest interstate war in the world at that time. The war was particularly tragic because it pitted against each other two countries that had been allies just 5 years earlier, led by former comrades who had fought together against the Derg regime. Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi and Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki had once been close collaborators in the struggle against military dictatorship, but their relationship had soured over economic policies, regional influence, and ultimately the question of where exactly the border between their newly separated countries should run. The conflict revealed how quickly post-Cold War optimism could collapse into brutal conventional warfare, reminiscent of World War I, complete with massive artillery barrages, trench warfare, and human wave attacks. The human cost of the border war was staggering and senseless. Between 70,000 and 300,000 people died in fighting that lasted from 1998 to 2000, making it one of the deadliest conflicts of the immediate post-Cold War period. Both countries spent enormous sums on military equipment rather than development, diverting scarce resources from reconstruction to destruction just when their populations most needed investment in peaceful progress. The war also displaced hundreds of thousands of people and created lasting trauma that affected an entire generation of Eritreans and Ethiopians who had already suffered through decades of conflict. When the fighting finally ended in June 2000 with the Algiers Agreement, both countries were exhausted and economically devastated, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. The peace agreement established a UN-patrolled buffer zone and created international arbitration mechanisms to resolve the border dispute once and for all. In April 2002, the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission issued what was supposed to be a final and binding decision, awarding the disputed town of Badme to Eritrea, while giving other contested areas to Ethiopia. Both countries initially promised to accept the ruling wholeheartedly, but Ethiopia later refused to implement it, creating a frozen conflict that would last for nearly 2 decades. The war and its aftermath marked a decisive turning point in Eritrean political development, transforming what had been an increasingly authoritarian but still relatively open society into one of the world's most repressive states. President Isaias used the crisis atmosphere to eliminate remaining voices of dissent within the government and ruling party, arguing that national security required absolute unity and that any criticism of government policy constituted treason. The war became a permanent justification for emergency rule, indefinite military conscription, and the systematic suppression of all independent civil society organizations. The decisive moment in this authoritarian consolidation came in September 2001, when 15 senior government officials and PFDJ members, who became known as the G15, wrote an open letter calling for democratic reforms and criticizing President Isaias's handling of the war and peace process. Their letter raised fundamental questions about governance, accountability, and the direction of Eritrean development that many citizens had been privately asking but few dared to voice publicly. The signatories included former foreign ministers, military commanders, and other high-ranking officials who had played crucial roles in the independence struggle. The government's response to the G15 was swift and brutal, demonstrating that the era of internal debate within the ruling party was definitively over. 11 of the G15 were arrested without trial and disappeared into the prison system, where they remain to this day, more than 2 decades later. The same week, all independent newspapers were shut down and their editors arrested, many of whom also remain in prison without trial. That week in September 2001 marked the end of any pretense of democratic development in Eritrea and the beginning of one of the world's most complete authoritarian systems. Elections that had been promised for later that year were indefinitely postponed. The constitution that had been carefully drafted and widely debated was shelved indefinitely. Independent media ceased to exist entirely. Political parties other than the PFDJ were banned, and civil society organizations were either dissolved or brought under direct government control. Perhaps most devastating was the expansion of national service from an 18-month program into indefinite military conscription that could last decades. Young Eritreans found themselves trapped in a system where completing high school automatically led to military service with no clear end date, preventing them from pursuing higher education, starting businesses, getting married, or building normal lives. The consequences of this system were predictable and tragic, creating a massive exodus of young Eritreans that continues to this day. Beginning in the early 2000s, young Eritreans began leaving the country in massive numbers, often undertaking dangerous journeys through Sudan and across the Mediterranean in desperate attempts to escape indefinite military service and the lack of economic opportunities. By some estimates, nearly 500,000 Eritreans, roughly 10% of the total population, now live outside the country, creating one of the world's largest refugee populations relative to national size. The exodus included many of the country's most educated and talented young people, creating a devastating brain drain that undermined long-term development prospects. International isolation deepened throughout the 2000s and 2010s as Eritrea's human rights record deteriorated, and its foreign policy became increasingly erratic and confrontational. The government was accused of supporting various armed groups throughout the region, leading to comprehensive UN sanctions and diplomatic ostracism that further damaged the economy and limited development opportunities. President Isaias's leadership style became increasingly personal and unpredictable, with cabinet meetings ceasing entirely after 2018, and all meaningful decision-making concentrated in the presidency. The country that had once been hailed as a potential model for African development became known instead as the North Korea of Africa, a closed society where basic freedoms had virtually disappeared. Yet even during this dark period, Eritrean society demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability under difficult circumstances. The diaspora community remained deeply connected to their homeland, sending remittances that helped sustain families and maintaining cultural traditions that kept Eritrean identity alive across continents. Within the country, people found creative ways to cope with difficult circumstances while preserving hopes for a better future. The government's infrastructure development projects, while often implemented through forced labour, did create roads, schools, and clinics that improved basic living conditions in many areas. Most importantly, the country avoided the complete state collapse that affected some of its neighbours, maintaining a functioning if highly authoritarian administration that provided basic services and security. Then, in 2018, something unexpected happened that offered genuine hope for positive change. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who had come to power promising democratic reforms and regional peace, announced that Ethiopia would finally accept the 2002 border ruling and implement the long-stalled Algiers Agreement. After 16 years of frozen conflict and mutual hostility, Ethiopia was prepared to hand over Badme and normalize relations with Eritrea. President Isaias responded positively to this overture, and in July 2018, the two leaders met in Asmara to sign a comprehensive peace agreement, formally ending the state of war between their countries. The scenes in Asmara during Prime Minister Abiy's historic visit were extraordinary and deeply moving. Hundreds of thousands of Eritreans lined the streets to welcome the Ethiopian delegation, singing and dancing in spontaneous celebrations that many observers compared to the independence festivities of 1993. After 20 years of hostility and isolation, there was suddenly tangible hope that Eritrea might rejoin the international community and begin addressing the domestic problems that had accumulated during the years of conflict and authoritarian rule. Airlines resumed flights between the capitals, telephone communications were restored, and families separated for decades were finally able to speak to each other again. The peace agreement brought some immediate improvements to daily life in Eritrea. UN sanctions were lifted, creating new opportunities for international investment and development assistance. Some travel restrictions were eased, allowing Eritreans more freedom of movement within the region. There were tentative hints that national service might be reformed and that some political prisoners might be released. Most importantly, the end of the border conflict removed the government's primary justification for maintaining an indefinite state of emergency. However, the initial euphoria of 2018 has given way to more sober assessments of the challenges facing Eritrean society. While relations with Ethiopia have improved dramatically and regional tensions have decreased, domestic political reform has been much slower and more limited than many had hoped. President Isaias remains firmly in power, with no clear succession plan. National elections have not been scheduled, and civil society remains tightly controlled. The peace agreement has brought some economic benefits and reduced regional tensions, but it has not fundamentally transformed Eritrean political life. As we conclude our journey through Eritrean history, we're left with a complex legacy that resists simple judgments. The struggle for independence was undoubtedly heroic and ultimately successful, demonstrating what a determined people could accomplish against overwhelming odds. The early years of independence showed genuine promise for democratic development, but the combination of external conflicts, internal power struggles, and authoritarian drift led to outcomes that few independence fighters had anticipated. Today's Eritrea embodies both the achievements and limitations of the independence project. The country has maintained its sovereignty and territorial integrity, avoided complete state collapse, and preserved a strong sense of national identity despite enormous challenges. Infrastructure has been rebuilt, basic services are provided, and cultural traditions have been maintained. At the same time, the political freedoms that many assumed would accompany independence remain largely unrealized, and too many talented Eritreans have been forced to seek opportunities outside their homeland. Chapter 6. Looking Forward. Eritrea's Tomorrow. As we contemplate Eritrea's future, we must begin with perhaps the most immediate and pressing question facing the country, the matter of political succession. President Isaias Afwerki, who has governed since independence in 1993, is now approaching 80 years of age, and the question of who might eventually succeed him has become increasingly urgent. Yet this is precisely the kind of institutional planning that the Eritrean system has consistently avoided, creating a situation where the country's political future remains deeply uncertain and potentially unstable. The challenge of succession in Eritrea is particularly complex, because the current system has been so thoroughly personalized around President Isaias himself. Unlike many other African countries where ruling parties have developed at least some institutional mechanisms for leadership transition, Eritrea has concentrated virtually all decision-making power in the presidency, while systematically weakening potential alternative centers of authority. Cabinet meetings have not been held since 2018. The National Assembly has been dormant for decades, and the ruling PFDJ party exists more as an administrative apparatus than as a genuine political organization with internal democracy or debate. This concentration of power creates what political scientists call a succession trap, a situation where the very mechanisms that keep an authoritarian leader in power also make it extremely difficult to manage the transition when that leader eventually departs. The absence of clear institutional procedures, the lack of obvious successors, and the potential for competing factions within the security apparatus all suggest that Eritrea could face significant instability whenever the current president leaves office, whether through natural causes, illness, or other circumstances. There are persistent rumors about potential succession arrangements, including speculation that President Isaias might prefer his eldest son Abraham to eventually assume leadership, but nothing has been formally announced or institutionalized. The military and security apparatus that has been so crucial to maintaining the current system might itself fracture without the unifying presence of the liberation-era leadership, potentially leading to internal conflicts that could destabilize the entire country. Alternatively, hardline elements within the current system might attempt to maintain the status quo without addressing the underlying problems that have driven so many Eritreans into exile. The succession question is made even more complicated by the demographic realities of contemporary Eritrea. The generation that fought the Liberation War and currently holds authority is aging, while the younger generation has either been excluded from real responsibility or has emigrated to escape indefinite national service. This creates a dangerous gap between the aging elite and the broader population, potentially leaving the country without experienced leaders who have both legitimacy and practical governing skills. Looking beyond succession, Eritrea faces enormous challenges related to its youth and demographic future. The massive emigration of young Eritreans over the past 2 decades represents not just a humanitarian tragedy, but also a fundamental threat to the country's long-term viability. When a country loses such a large percentage of its most educated and energetic young people, it undermines virtually every aspect of national development, from economic growth to social innovation to cultural continuity. The Eritrean diaspora now represents a complex and potentially transformative force in the country's future. Estimates suggest that nearly 500,000 Eritreans live outside the country, creating communities in North America, Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere that often maintain strong emotional and financial connections to their homeland. These diaspora communities send substantial remittances that help sustain families inside Eritrea, but they also represent a vast pool of human capital that could potentially contribute to national development if political conditions were different. Interestingly, the diaspora communities have become spaces where alternative visions of Eritrean future are being developed and debated in ways that are impossible within the country itself. Young Eritreans in diaspora often maintain strong cultural identities and pride in their heritage, while also developing democratic political sensibilities and entrepreneurial skills that could be invaluable if they were able to return and contribute to national development. However, the distance from home and the divisions within diaspora communities also create challenges for translating diaspora energy into practical political change within Eritrea. The economic dimensions of Eritrea's future present both opportunities and significant obstacles. The country possesses substantial mineral resources, including gold, copper, zinc, and potash deposits that could potentially generate significant revenue for development if properly managed. Mining operations that began in the 2010s have already provided important foreign exchange earnings, and demonstrated that Eritrea has the potential to develop a more diversified economy beyond traditional agriculture and small-scale manufacturing. However, realizing this economic potential will require fundamental changes in governance and economic policy that seem unlikely under current arrangements. The state-controlled economy, with its emphasis on national service, labor, and centralized planning, has proven incapable of generating the kind of sustainable growth needed to provide opportunities for young Eritreans or to reduce the country's dependence on diaspora remittances. Most international investors and development partners remain wary of engagement, given the poor human rights record and unpredictable policy environment. The question of national service reform represents perhaps the single most important policy challenge facing Eritrea's future. The current system of indefinite military conscription has become both a major driver of emigration and a significant obstacle to economic development, since it removes large numbers of young people from productive economic activity while providing them with minimal compensation. Various international observers have suggested that reforming national service to make it genuinely limited in duration could be a crucial first step toward broader political and economic opening. Yet, reforming national service would require the government to abandon one of its primary mechanisms for social control and economic mobilization, something that seems unlikely without broader political changes. The current leadership appears to view indefinite conscription as essential for maintaining security and implementing development projects, even though the economic and human costs have become increasingly apparent. This creates a classic policy trap where the very mechanism used to maintain control becomes an obstacle to the kind of development that might ultimately provide more sustainable security. Eritrea's regional relationships will also play a crucial role in determining its future trajectory. The 2018 peace agreement with Ethiopia represented a major breakthrough that reduced regional tensions and created new possibilities for economic cooperation and political development. However, translating this diplomatic opening into sustained progress has proven more difficult than initially hoped, and regional dynamics continue to create both opportunities and constraints for Eritrean development. The broader Horn of Africa region remains volatile and conflict-prone, with ongoing instability in Sudan, Somalia, and parts of Ethiopia, creating both security challenges and potential opportunities for Eritrea to play a more constructive regional role. The country's strategic location on the Red Sea and its ports could potentially serve as important economic assets if regional trade and cooperation were to expand, but this would require the kind of predictable governance and international cooperation that has been largely absent under current arrangements. The international community's approach to Eritrea will also significantly influence the country's future possibilities. The lifting of UN sanctions following the 2018 peace deal created space for renewed engagement, but many potential partners remain cautious about deeper cooperation given ongoing human rights concerns and the lack of meaningful political reforms. European Union efforts to provide development assistance in hopes of reducing emigration have had limited success, largely because they fail to address the political root causes of the refugee crisis. Climate change represents another major challenge that will shape Eritrea's future in ways that are difficult to predict or control. Like much of the Horn of Africa, Eritrea is vulnerable to changing rainfall patterns, increasing temperatures, and more frequent droughts that could devastate agricultural production and exacerbate food insecurity. The country's limited institutional capacity and international isolation make it particularly vulnerable to climate shocks, potentially creating additional pressures for emigration and social instability. However, climate challenges could also create opportunities for international cooperation and development assistance that might help catalyze broader reforms. Renewable energy projects, sustainable agriculture initiatives, and disaster preparedness programs represent areas where international partners might be willing to engage, even in the absence of broader political reforms, potentially creating models for more extensive cooperation if political conditions were to improve. The role of technology and communications in Eritrea's future remains highly uncertain but potentially significant. The government's tight control over internet access and telecommunications has limited the kind of digital connectivity that has transformed many other developing countries, but technological change has a way of undermining authoritarian control mechanisms over time. The growing connectivity of diaspora communities and the gradual expansion of mobile communications within Eritrea could potentially create new spaces for civil society development and political organization. Education represents both a major challenge and a crucial opportunity for Eritrea's future development. The country has made significant investments in expanding primary education and has achieved relatively high literacy rates compared to regional averages. But the flight of educated young people and the constraints imposed by national service have undermined efforts to develop the human capital needed for sustained economic growth. Creating educational opportunities that actually lead to meaningful employment and career advancement within Eritrea will be essential for convincing young people that they have a future in their homeland. Perhaps most fundamentally, Eritrea's future will depend on whether the country can eventually develop political institutions and civil society that would allow its people to participate meaningfully in shaping their own destiny. The current system's emphasis on top-down control has created a situation where even positive changes are difficult to implement effectively because they lack broad-based support. The experience of other countries suggests that authoritarian systems can sometimes evolve gradually toward more open governance, but this typically requires leadership willing to accept some reduction in centralized control in exchange for greater legitimacy. Whether Eritrea's current or future leadership will prove capable of such adaptation remains highly uncertain, but the costs of continued isolation and repression seem likely to mount over time. There are some modest grounds for optimism about Eritrea's long-term prospects. Despite the formidable challenges currently facing the country, the Eritrean people have demonstrated remarkable resilience and resourcefulness throughout their history. From the long struggle for independence through the difficult years since, the strong sense of national identity that sustained the liberation struggle remains alive, both within the country and in diaspora communities, providing a foundation for eventual national renewal if political conditions were to improve. The country's cultural diversity, while sometimes portrayed as a source of potential conflict, could actually serve as a strength for building a more inclusive and democratic society. Eritrea's tradition of managing relationships among different ethnic and religious communities could provide models for political accommodation if space were created for genuine dialogue and participation. The fact that the independence struggle successfully united people from different backgrounds around common goals suggests that such unity might be possible again under different circumstances. Moreover, the very severity of current problems could potentially create pressure for meaningful change that might not exist if conditions were more comfortable for those in power. The massive emigration of young people, the economic stagnation, and the international isolation all impose real costs on the current system that may eventually force adaptation or reform. Historical experience suggests that even highly authoritarian systems can reach tipping points where the costs of repression exceed the benefits, creating opportunities for transformation. The international context may also become more favorable to positive change in Eritrea over time. Regional developments, changing global attitudes toward governance and human rights, and the demonstrated costs of prolonged authoritarianism could all create new pressures and opportunities for reform. The peace agreement with Ethiopia showed that even seemingly intractable conflicts can sometimes be resolved unexpectedly, suggesting that other positive changes might also be possible under the right circumstances. As we conclude our long journey through Eritrean history, we're left with more questions than answers about what the future might bring. Will the country eventually develop the democratic institutions and economic opportunities that could convince its young people to stay and contribute to national development? Will the aging leadership prove capable of managing a peaceful transition to a new generation of leaders who might approach governance differently? Will regional peace and international cooperation create space for the kind of reforms that could unlock Eritrea's considerable potential? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable from our current vantage point. What we can say with confidence is that the future of Eritrea will ultimately be determined by the choices made by Eritreans themselves, both those who remain in the country and those who continue to maintain connections from abroad. The remarkable courage and determination that carried the independence struggle to victory against overwhelming odds suggest that the Eritrean people possess the qualities needed to overcome their current challenges if they are given the opportunity to do so. As you drift off to sleep, dear listeners, perhaps you will dream of that small country by the Red Sea where ancient civilizations once flourished, where ordinary people achieved the extraordinary feat of liberation through 3 decades of struggle, and where the future remains unwritten. The Eritrean story is far from over, and how it ultimately concludes will depend on choices yet to be made and opportunities yet to be seized. In the meantime, we can only hope that somehow, someday, the promise of freedom that motivated so much sacrifice will finally be fulfilled for all Eritreans, wherever they may call home,